In this study, we will discover that God provided the sign of the Son of Man to affirm that the gospel will go into all the world to redeem the elect during those days after the Great Tribulation. Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man from heaven. And we know from Luke chapter 21, verse 25, that the sign of the Son of Man will be accompanied by signs in the sun, moon, and stars. Okay, so how are we to understand these signs, particularly the sign of the Son of Man? Is the Bible teaching that we're going to look up and literally see signs in the sun, moon, and stars? Absolutely not. According to Matthew chapter 12, verse 39, God will not give this evil generation a sign except the sign of Jonah. The sign of Jonah points to the gospel, which teaches that we are saved by the faith of Jesus Christ, who died for the sins of his people, the elect, not for the sins of every person in the world, as taught in many churches today. So there is no question that the sign of the Son of Man, as well as the signs in the sun, moon, and stars, are all pointing to the gospel message. Now, in this study, we're going to learn that the sign of the Son of Man is related to two historical events that are identified with the Great Tribulation. Recall, we learned in Luke chapter 21, verse 20, that the Great Tribulation is typified as a time when Jerusalem was surrounded by armies, namely the armies of the Assyrians and the Babylonians, as we read in Isaiah chapter 36 and Jeremiah chapter 32. In both instances, God provided signs to indicate that the gospel will go forth to deliver God's elect from captivity when these enemies are destroyed. And in the case of the Babylonians, we learned in our sun-darkening study that God gave us the ensign of the root of Jesse, who represents Christ. Let's turn to Isaiah chapter 11, where we read about the sign of Jesse. And in that day there shall be a root of Jesse, which shall stand for an ensign, that's the word sign, of the people. To it shall the Gentiles seek, and his rest shall be glorious. In this context, specifically verse 12, God is speaking about using this ensign to gather together the dispersed of Judah who were scattered in the four corners of the earth when Israel was conquered by the Babylonians. We find similar language in Matthew chapter 24, verse 31, where God says that he will send his angels to gather together his elect who were also scattered in the four winds or the four corners of the earth. And they were gathered after God sent forth the sign of the Son of Man. Essentially, God is teaching us that the sign of the Son of Man and the sign of the Son of Jesse are one and the same. Both point to the fact that we will be delivered from Satan the Antichrist, who represents the king of Babylon. And once we come out of the church, the gospel will go into the world via the sign of the Son of Man and the sign of the root of Jesse. Okay, now let's move on to the Assyrians. In the case of the Assyrians, God gave Hezekiah two signs, which are identified with the sign of the Son of Man. The first sign is found in Isaiah chapter 37. We begin in verse 29. Because of thy rage against me and thy tumult is come upon mine ears, Therefore I will put my hook in thy nose, and my bridle in thy lips, and I will turn thee back by the way which thou camest. And this shall be a sign unto thee. Ye shall eat this year such as groweth of itself, and the second year that which springeth of the same. And the third year sow ye and reap, and plant vineyards, and eat the fruit thereof. So in this setting, God has mandated 2 Sabbath years by which there was to be no sowing or reaping. And then in the third year, he says there's going to be sowing and reaping, and there's going to be fruit from the vineyard. But during those first 2 years, God declares a Sabbath. And we know this from Leviticus chapter 25, where we read that there is to be no sowing or reaping during the 7 cycles of Sabbaths, to include the 50th year, which was a Jubilee year, wherein there was to be no sowing or reaping. So God is using Hezekiah's first sign to teach us that the Great Tribulation began in the Jubilee Sabbath year of 1994. We know this because Matthew chapter 24, verse 20 typifies the Great Tribulation as a Sabbath. And so during that first part of the Great Tribulation, from 1994 to the year 2000 AD, there was no sowing or reaping because the believers, typified as the 2 witnesses, were no longer able to bring the gospel in the church. But once God's elect came out of the church, God sent forth the latter rain, and there was fruit. That is, that vineyard produced fruit in the 3rd year. And this is precisely why Joel chapter 2 indicates that God sent forth the latter rain after the northern army, that is, the Assyrian army, was destroyed. Okay, now we're going to examine the second sign that was given to Hezekiah. And once again, we see that this second sign is used to affirm that God will deliver us from the king of Assyria. And this is articulated in Isaiah chapter 38, verse 6. And I will deliver thee and this city out of the hand of the king of Assyria, and I will defend this city. And this shall be a sign unto thee from the Lord, that the Lord will do this thing that he hath spoken. Behold, I will bring again the shadow of the degrees, which is gone down in the sundial of Ahaz, 10 degrees backwards. So the sun returned 10 degrees, by the which degrees it was gone down. Now God is using this sign to teach us that he controls the times and the seasons. According to Daniel chapter 2, verse 21, God also removeth the kings in the sense that he controls times and seasons. That is, he controls history. In this respect, God loosed Satan, the Antichrist, and he allowed him to rule over the church for 2,300 days. And then, when it was time for God to deliver his elect, he destroyed Satan, the Antichrist, and then brought the believers out of the church and gave them the sign of Jonah, or the sign of the Son of Man, by which they receive the gospel as it goes into the world to save God's elect. Moreover, Hezekiah used the sundial of Ahaz to demonstrate that the believers, who are the wise, according to Daniel chapter 2, verse 21, they will be able to discern the signs of the times. They will understand the sign of Jonah. However, in Matthew chapter 16, God warns that an evil and an adulterous generation will seek after a sign, but none will be given it except the sign of Jonah. Because when we get to the last days, many people in the church are going to be focused on signs in the sky, looking at literal stars to try to discern the future. Some will be interested in dreams and visions to try to learn the future. And a great many of people will be involved in speaking in tongues and falling backwards. All of these things are used to indicate that Satan, the Antichrist, is ruling the hearts of the unsaved in the church. But insofar as the true believers, God tells us in Luke chapter 21 that when they see all of these things coming up on the earth, God says, lift up your heads because your redemption draweth nigh. In other words, when you lift up your head, you're going to see the sign of the Son of Man. And you're going to identify that sign of the Son of Man with the sign of Jonah. Because the true believers, God's elect, they're not going to be deceived by the signs that are being brought by the false Christ and the false prophets. God's elect will only see these signs as they read the Bible. And in this respect, the heaven is typified in Revelation chapter 6 as a scroll. And so as we're looking into the Bible, that's how we see the sign of Jonah. And that's how we see the sign of the Son of Man, to help us to know that our redemption is nigh. And we know from Matthew chapter 24, verse 14, that this redemption will continue until the gospel goes into all the world. And once God has saved the last of his elect, the end will come.